here we are. Okay. All right. We are now live. So, welcome everybody. This has been a night that I have been looking forward to for so long and have been really anticipating. I'm very excited that The Shape of Thunder is now in the world, and I can make sure I put this in as many hands as possible because this is probably one of the most powerful books that I have read in a really, really long time. And I didn't introduce myself. I'm so sorry, everybody. I am Kathleen with Anderson's Bookshop, and I am so, so happy to have you all here. But yeah, Shape of Thunder, y'all, if you have not had a chance to read this book, trust me when I tell you, you are going to want to clear your schedule and get rid of anybody else that's in your house and make yourself a pot of tea, a pot of coffee, whatever your favorite beverage is, and sit down with this book because it will grab you by your soul and hold on. I can still remember the chills I got when I read the first paragraph. So, Jasmine, thank you so much for this beautiful but at times heartbreaking, but beautiful and hopeful story. It is absolutely exquisite. And as much as I loved Other Words from Home, I think you have outdone yourself with this book. So, but y'all, tonight you have a twofer because in addition to the brilliant, beautiful Jasmine Warga, we also have the the brilliant, beautiful Padma Venkatraman, who is an exquisite writer in her own right and has written probably two of my favorite books, Bridge Home, which was also a Mock Newbery when it was first released, and Time to Dance. Oh my God, Padma, that book was absolutely delicious. Thank you so much for that. So listen, I could sit here and wax on all night about these two wonderful writers that we have with us tonight, but I'm going to let them do their own talking. So without further ado, ladies, thank you both so much. I'm going to turn myself off and let you guys have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Jasmine, for inviting me to do this because it is just such a joy and such an honor. And there's a few things I love better than to promote as much as I can a book that I love. And I told you this already, and I did tell the whole world, but I'm going to say this again. When I started reading A Shape of Thunder, the first book that came into my mind was Speak, which I have on my shelf, because there was some resonance when you meet Cora in the first chapter. There is something going on and you don't exactly know what that is. There's a hint of that. And as I read it, I had that same feeling that I had in the first few pages of Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson, which was, what is going on? And then you love this character so much that you stay with this character. And then you meet her friend, Quinn. And the way that these two young people relate and the tragedy that has occurred that has both links them and then also pushes them apart is just a horrifying reality, unfortunately, that we all face and young people face in our nation today. So, there was that sort of the duality between these two characters that you read each of their voices. And then as you go on, there is this part that I said to Jasmine, it just reminded me of The Bridge to Terabithia. And Jasmine said, you know what? She said something, she shared something, and I'm going to have her share that with you.
Yeah, so first, before I share that, I just want to say thank you so much to Kathleen and everyone at Anderson's who are amazing. I feel so lucky to call you my neighborhood indie bookstore. I loved your store long before I was lucky enough to live in the area that you are, and I'm so grateful for you to having me tonight. And so many thanks to you, Padma, for spending time with me this evening to talk about the book. I'm such a huge admirer of your writing, your work, and also you just as a person. So it's really special for me to get to celebrate the book with you. And when you told me that, I shrieked on the phone because The Bridge to Terabithia was such a source of inspiration from the very beginning for this book, because I was thinking back to books I loved when I was a young person. And I'm not sure I had a more transformative reading experience than that book. In that was my first experience with a book that I felt like was very honest with me. And I was really sort of flattened by how honest it was with me about the hard things in the world. But I also felt really empowered by that honesty, by the fact that it sort of challenged me as a reader. And in doing so, made me feel like it cared about what I thought about the world and knew that I was able to handle these things and did think about these complicated things. So I was thinking a lot about that. And also, the Bridge to Terabitha is such a celebration of imagination, right? And young people's imagination. And to me, at its heart, I also think of the Shape of Thunder in that way, because our young people are extraordinary in that ability. I think all of us who write for young people know that, especially those of us who are lucky enough to write for this specific age of middle grade, that's that intersection, right, between being able to talk about those really heavy and difficult things while also bringing to the table enormous hearts and really expansive imaginations. And so I wanted to write a book that kind of lived at the intersection. And to me, like, the Bridge of Terabitha is the gold standard for books that live at that intersection.
And speaking of honesty, I mean, one of the things that I loved so much about this book is that it is absolutely, absolutely honest. I mean, to the point that, and it speaks to the reader directly. When you read the author's note, there is essentially, to me, it's just a letter. It is a letter that is just a love letter to your readers, to middle grade children. And I just thought, from the first page to the last page, all of you who are going to buy this book and read this book are going to treasure it, I know, as much as I do, because there is just something of Jasmine, I think, that just comes through her care and her concern about something that is horrifying. And that's gun violence. And I'm going to let her tell us a little bit about the personal impact as well that it had, and the reason that she was inspired to write this, because she said something to me that I found very moving.
Yeah, so the first sort of, I guess, kernel of inspiration or first idea I had to write a book that would address the subject came a long time ago, when my family, we were still living in our Chicago apartment. We lived across the school from the elementary school where my daughter, if we'd stayed there, would have eventually gone to kindergarten. And I started thinking about how pretty soon she was going to go to this school that had active shooter drills. And I didn't know what I was going to say to her about that. I didn't have the language to explain why the world was that way and why this was the solution grown-ups had come up with to this problem. And then, while this was living in my head, I was lucky enough that I started getting to do a lot more school visits in service of talking and promoting other words for home. And when I would go to these school visits, I noticed a couple of things. One, how different entering a school is from when you and I were kids, and how much heightened security there is, and how this is an ever-present thought in the school. And then from getting to speak with students and talk with them, realizing how much this issue weighed on them and affected them. And I realized that we kind of had this silo of silence around this issue for younger people, even though the trauma of this violence affects everyone. And it certainly affects our young people in the way we've arranged their schools, where they spend so much of their time. They know that their safety isn't guaranteed. And that's just heartbreaking to me. And it's even more heartbreaking to me that we've somehow deemed it inappropriate to let them talk about this issue, because I think that's always the thing, right? That we all want the world to be better for our kids, but I think our job as writers for young people is kind of to make this link between like the imperfect past and imperfect present to the possibilities of a better future, right? And that's what stories can do. And I think all of us who write for young people know how aware they are. And so I wanted to write a book that said, I see you, and I know that this is happening in our country, and I know that it's horrifying, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about how things can be better. Because I don't have the answers. I think that's the other thing that people sometimes don't understand about us novelists is it's more, I write about things I don't understand to ask this question of, does this bother you too? Do you think there's something wrong about this too? As opposed to, I have the solution to this issue. And so I guess it started with love and fear for my own children and grew out of love and fear for our readers, who I feel deeply connected to all of the kids that I get to meet through school visits and who write to me. And I think that that's one of the biggest joys to me about this job is the longer that I get to do it, the more informed my work is by kids, because there's such a wonderful give and take that we get to have with our readers from getting to meet with them. So yeah, I definitely think of the book as hard of a book as it is at times as a love letter to young people of saying, I love you and I think the world should be better. And I also think that you have the ability to make the world better.
Yeah, I mean, that comes through, so beautifully. And before we, move away from this, I just do want to say something else that really struck me and spoke to me, and I felt was so important that you addressed in that author's note, was the fact that in certain communities, gun violence gets a great deal more recognition and publicity around it, in terms of people in some places acknowledging it, and in some places just having the same trauma go unacknowledged, and people are remaining sort of, invisible and unrecognized in that trauma that they undergo.
Yeah, no, it was really important for me to address that in the author's note because it is a story that takes place in a rather affluent, upper middle class suburban town. And often when this type of violence happens in those areas, it gets a different kind of media coverage than when it happens in less economically well-off areas. And also oftentimes when it happens in more like white majority areas, it gets more attention than when it happens in brown and Black communities. And so it was really important for me to address that in the author's note so that my readers knew that when I'm talking about wanting a better future and a safer world for our kids, that I mean all of our kids. It's always really important for me just to lay that out there because I don't think that can be said enough, especially when I made the active creative choice to set it in a community more like the community that I live in and the community that I grew up in, which definitely has a great amount of like privilege to those communities.
Absolutely. But when you begin, I mean, as much as this is about so many hard topics, there is also this real core of friendship and what friendship is that comes through. So I have two things to ask Jasmine. The first is that one of the other things that I loved about this was the first sentence, which is about math and science and how much Cora loves them both. And this really spoke to me because I am trained as an oceanographer. I got my PhD in oceanography at a time when there were hardly any women and certainly hardly any women of color in the field. And so I love it when we have characters that actually say they love math and science. And there is this wonderful element, as you pointed out, of imagination that is a sort of sci-fi-ish idea that one of the characters has. And I don't know if you want to speak about that just a little bit to touch on that.
Yeah, well, first I want to shout out, I think that my daughters are watching downstairs, and my oldest daughter, she wants to be an oceanographer. So I think she's very excited to hear that was your career.
And you write to Auntie Padma whenever you want to, okay? And I can talk to you about that.
You hear that, Lillian? So we'll talk about that after. But so I think, I have increasingly become interested in like the overlap between creativity and science. Because I think when I was growing up, I often thought of them as very separate. And I really pushed back against science because I felt a lot of pressure when I was growing up to be a doctor, which is, I think, kind of a classic trope of the daughter of an immigrant. And I saw science as really like rigid and not creative. And as I become an adult, one of the kind of funny joys is in my creative career, I find myself turning towards science again and again, and sort of this link in this idea that science is the magic of our world and how extraordinary it is. And I had become really interested at the time that I was thinking about all of those big questions about gun violence and lockdown drills. I had also been, just separately, completely unrelated, reading all these articles about time travel and the possibility of it on an actual physics level. And I think, and I'm sure you know how this works, just ideas kind of collide and smash up against one another. But I did really want to, I love exploring that and this idea of possibility, because I think so often when we talk about a better world, it's hard for us to imagine things that haven't happened, but our world changes constantly. And that's the power of human imagination. I mean, I'm talking to you through a screen right now. That would have been bananas to think about just, a couple decades ago. So I think that really suited what I was trying, kind of one of the major themes of the book, which is about this boldness of imagination, which is what I think we really need when it comes to the issue of gun violence, is this idea of infinite imagination and really being willing to push our brains to try to imagine something much different and much better.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't say enough about how all of that ties in so well, so beautifully, and works brilliantly. And it's not just the two girls. I mean, I feel like every character that you meet really is not just a character on paper, but comes alive and is a character in flesh and blood. And that is just, part of this magical writer that we have here, Jasmine, today. So you know what I'm going to say? I see where we are in terms of time. And so I'm going to say, would you please, before we open up to Q&A, read just a little bit so that we can hear it?
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to read just the opening page or so, which is, so the book, for those of you who haven't read it yet, which is probably most of you since it just came out today, the book alternates between Cora and Quinn's perspectives. And so the first chapter opens from Cora's perspective, and it opens with the line that Padma so beautifully was talking about. So here we go. Chapter 1. I like learning things, especially about math and science, because they help explain why the world is the way it is. A famous mathematician once said, mathematics is the music of reason. I've always believed that. The best thing about math is that it makes sense. The actual best thing about math is that everything adds up, all neat and in order. Here's what I know about the number 12. 12 is 4 times 3. 12 is 6 times 2. 12 is 10 plus 2. This is all simple math, right? Elementary school stuff, reason and logic. 12 is also 2 less than 14. 14 is how old Mabel was when she died. I'm 12 today. Someday in the future, I will be more than 12 plus 2. I will become older than my older sister. There is no music in that fact, and there is absolutely no reason. It does not add up, all neat and in order.
And I mean, I think anyone, and especially at this time when so many of us have had so many losses, I mean, it just brings that through as well, the idea of loss. And yet with all the grief and the tragedy that is so honest and so very real in the book, there's also so much hope. And, it leaves you in this place of imagination, of hope. And so I'm going to just say again, thank you so much, Jasmine, for having me do this, because it is a very special book. And Kathleen and Anderson's Bookstore, thanks you as well so much for having me. And we're still here and we still have time. And Kathleen suggested 8:20 would be when I would, stoppish with this interview to see if you have any questions.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention in my introduction, and I am so sorry, everybody, but if you do have questions, feel free. I cannot talk today, y'all. I'm so sorry. I'm so excited about this. Feel free to drop them in the Q&A, and we will run through them. But I kind of wanted to pick up. Oh, we have a question. And Elise would like to know, Jasmine, who do you identify with more, Cora or Quinn?
Hi, Woo. Elise is a friend of mine. And good question. So, I think that lots of people assume that I relate more to Cora because outwardly we seem more similar. Like she's also half Arab, and she seems a little bit more like, I don't know how people I think imagine that I might have been as a child, but in lots of ways, I actually was much more like Quinn in that I was very dreamy and had a mind that often wandered around. And so I think that the trick of the book for me is that I buried pieces of myself and my heart in both of the girls, and also buried pieces of things that I love about people close to me in both of them. And in that way, I felt really connected to both of them. So I'm not sure that's a super satisfactory answer, but I think that, I really relate to Cora's struggles with her identity and questions about like she feels too much and not enough, which is definitely something that was a really present narrative for me as a kid. But I also, worried a lot about not feeling smart enough in the way that Quinn does. And feeling like I couldn't hang because I didn't always like process as fast or learn in the exact way that was the only one way that they were teaching something. And so I think, I see myself in both of them. And I also see myself in a lot of like the side characters too. And I don't know, Padma, if it's this way for you, but I feel like the older I get, the more I'm like, oh, I'm not like either of the kids. I'm the librarian. Like, I really relate more to my, or I'm like the dad. Like I relate to the grown-up characters so much more than when I first started writing when I was much younger. I was like completely disinterested in like parents and grown-ups. And I feel like now I'm much more interested in those secondary characters too.
I feel like I am. I still am a bit. I don't know. I still love my kids, though. I think, and I love what you said, though, resonated with me so much about having a piece of every character that I can relate to. I mean, even some of my characters that I don't like very much. I still have something that I feel like, even if it's not on screen, I can see and relate to, because then I think they become much more human. And I love also what you say about how, Cora and Quinn are both parts of you, and both parts of you that you think of. And I think when that happens, that feeds into, I think both of us like to ask questions, like to see a book as a question, not as an answer.
Yes.
And I think a problem, an issue as complex as the one in The Shape of Thunder or any that I have written about are not any kind of question that would deserve or that could get a pat answer. These are complex questions and many different ways of answering them, which, I think is so valid. I see Greg has a question which says, from Juniper, to whom is this book dedicated?
Oh, that's a flex from Juniper. So she wants everyone to know that the book is dedicated to her and her sister. So at the very beginning of the book, it says, for Lillian Noor and Juniper Lee, who ask big questions. And that gets exactly to the heart of what you were just speaking about so beautifully, Padma, that my kids and all of the young people that I've been lucky enough to meet through school visits and book events have this capacity for wondering about our world and asking and constantly asking why, and why is it this way, and how can it be better, and how can I help to make it better. And I wanted to dedicate it to them because I honor that in them, and that curiosity that they have now is like my number one source of inspiration. So Juniper, you got your name, shout it out. There you go.
Oh, this is too funny. Okay, we have Julia who says, hi, Jasmine, can't wait to read the book. Since I haven't read it yet, I will ask about a different topic. And I think you might have to ask her later. Why does Lillian want to be an oceanographer, not a pathologist?
Oh, that's an amazing question. So hi, Julia. Julia's a close family friend of mine. And my father is a pathologist, and he wants everyone to be a doctor, as I hinted at earlier. I shouldn't answer for Lillian, but I think it's because she's fascinated by the ocean. She really is interested in scuba diving and is interested in the adventure that it holds, and is very curious about all of the creatures that live in our ocean and see it as a really interesting unknown place to explore, and how much of our world is covered with ocean, and how actually little we know about all the different layers of it. So I think, again, it's that curiosity. And I think it seems much more exciting to her than being a pathologist, but no shade at all the pathologists who may be here. I grew up with pathologists, so.
All right, we have a question from Lindsay Stoddard, and I am going to just go off screen for a second because I'm going to pull her lovely book, which I have off the shelf, and wave it at all of you. But Lindsay says, can you talk a little bit about the experience of writing from two different points of view? Did you write linearly? Did you think of their arcs separately, or were they interwoven from the beginning? So for any young people who are there, essentially Lindsay is saying, did you think about Cora's story and Quinn's story separately? How did you weave these two stories together? Because you bounce between the two voices of Quinn and Cora.
That's such a fantastic question. I know Padma's going to go get the book, but I also want to shout out that Lindsay had another fantastic contemporary middle grade book come out last week called B is for Blended. And yes, everyone should pick it up and read it. Lindsay's books are so great, especially if you love like contemporary middle grade, which hopefully most of you here tonight do. So and what a great question. So the question was about the 2 points of view in the book, and whether I wrote all through one viewpoint and then wrote the other viewpoint all the way through, or if I went back and forth as I wrote. And the answer is, when I first had the idea for the book, I thought of it only as Cora's story. And then as I started to write, because I don't plot anything, I just write, which is always a gigantic mess, and it's why my process is so messy and I go through lots and lots of drafts. But as I was writing, I realized Cora was estranged from her best friend, and I realized it was because of this tragedy that had occurred. And then I was like, oh, and then Quinn showed up, and I really realized that the book was going to be much more interesting if I told the book from both points of view. And I also think, every book I'm trying to challenge myself to do something different as a writer. I'm always trying to grow and experiment and try different things. And I had never written a novel in two different voices before. And it really stressed me out because I was really, really worried. I really wanted to make sure both voices were super distinct. And I remember a long, long time ago when my debut book had come out, even before it was coming out, I went to the Decatur Book Festival and I got to listen to Jandy Nelson speak, and I'll Give You the Sun was just coming out. And she talked a lot about how when she was writing that book, she wrote like all of one character's perspective and then kind of like kept that unlocked so she didn't merge the voices. And so that's what I had intended to do because I love Jandy's work and I want to be exactly like her. But it didn't work for me. I had to go back and forth because that was the rhythm of how my brain was going to figure it out. But I think what helped me to keep the voices distinct was doing the character work to understand them. So understanding that Cora was much more pandemic and analytical and serious. And so her sentences would be more clipped and more direct, and Quinn was going to have more lyrical language because she's dreamier and more kind of run-on sentences because that's how our brain works. And once I'd figured that out, it was easy enough for me to toggle back and forth. But I almost needed that toggle to find the momentum of the narrative, since I don't plot ahead of time and I'm always trying to figure out like, okay, where is this going? And I needed that push and pull is actually the momentum that the book runs on. And so that's what took me through the drafts.
Yeah, and I love one of the things that I really love about this book is, I have read, and I will never ever name the books that I've read that I don't like, unless they have something really, really bad in them. But sometimes you read a book that is written from two points of view, but for me, the test is if I open the book in the middle, can I tell who's speaking? And with this one, you can. So, I mean, Jasmine has actually done that in The Shape of Thunder, and that is not easy to do. And she has actually, I think, and I hope, and I really apologize if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. I'm going to try. Razan Abdin Adnani asked a question, and I think Jasmine has actually just answered that, because it's just about what did you find to be the most difficult part of finding these two distinct, authentic voices and keeping them separately. So fabulous question. I feel like you anticipated it. Jasmine and Razan, again, fabulous question. I'm going to skip over that mainly because she answered it. Allison, Allison asks, do you have any advice for would-be young writers?
Yes. So my first advice is always to read. I think that reading, I think of myself as a reader before I think of myself as a writer. I'm a writer because I'm a reader. My writing is born out of my love of reading. And I always think of writing as a conversation, and reading is that listening part. You have to read other stories to understand kind of what it is that you want to say. What is your part in this conversation going to be? And you also, the amazing thing is that it doesn't cost any money to get better at writing, because we can all get a library card, though ideally you'll be supporting your independent bookstore like Anderson's and getting some books from them as well. But it's really terrific that writing isn't a craft that has like a barrier of materials that you need to buy or anything. You just need your imagination, a pen, paper, and books, because you're going to learn this idea of story and how stories work and the structure of stories from reading. I don't have a great formal understanding of plot. Like, I couldn't plot for you any of my books into a 3-act structure. But I think because I've read so many books, I have this idea of what the momentum of a story should feel like. But I only have gotten that information from reading. But then the second thing that I want to say is that to own the label of writer. It took me so long to call myself a writer. I would always say I'm an aspiring writer, even when I was writing. And I was waiting for that person to tap me on the shoulder and say, you're good enough, you're legitimate. And I'm here to tell you that, I've had some fabulous, fantastic things happen to me in my writing career, and still I have days. I have lots of days where I feel insecure and not good enough and like I can't do this. And what I return to is that confidence I found when I decided myself to call myself a writer. So my biggest advice is to learn to find that self-belief, because you're going to need that, and you're going to need to hold on to that through all of the highs and the lows of publishing, and to kind of be able to create that space between having it be about the writing. I think when I was a young writer, I was so thirsty to get published, and it was so about this idea of getting published. And I think it's so important to hold on to it being about the writing, and the rest will come. My best work has always come when I'm not anticipating, it's not an outcome driven thing. It's just about the act of doing the work that I want to be doing and hopefully creating something interesting, but I'm not thinking about any of what comes after. So those are my two, I guess, big pieces of advice: to read as much as you can and to call yourself a writer, because you are a writer, and the only person who controls that is you. And that should, I hope that feels like empowering for young writers, because that's what I always return to when I'm struggling.
Well, I really think that it does, and I hope so too, very much, because that is very, very much the answer that I give as well, which is just this. And I would add to that, the things that we get, and I say this over and over again, and it's so hard. I mean, I sometimes say this to adults as well, right? And I have to say it even to myself, because it is so easy. It is so easy to be all about the big shiny stickers that you get, or how much sales there are. And gosh, that is part of it, but all of that doesn't have I'm not going to say it doesn't have anything to do with a good book, because of course that there is that too, but not every fabulous book gets that acclaim. So not every fabulous writer is recognized the way that they should be. Not every fabulous writer is celebrated. So don't be carried away. This is something I would say always to a young person who's writing. Don't be carried away by who says what about your writing. And I am, just because you asked about a young writer, so I have to say this, which is that recently my daughter was at this, writing competition thing, which she won, which was fabulous. But she came home, and what really meant so much to me was that she said, Mom, I won't mention this other kid who was not even a friend of hers in the class was crying and said, Mommy, can you call her? And I was so proud of my daughter for doing that, because it was just such a compassionate thing to do. And I really think that I called and I chatted to the young person. And what I said was just this, right? Winning a competition doesn't make you a writer. Love of writing makes you a writer. Love of books makes you a writer. So, keep, like Jasmine said, keep the writing in focus. That's what makes you a writer. What happens to your writing, you can't control. And that's not what makes you a good writer or a better writer or not so good writer or anything like that. So I would say that. And then we have Gretchen, who said, you mentioned that you started thinking about this topic by noticing the differences in schools today than from your childhood. I'm curious if your family has ever been touched by this issue, and or if you did research to get different perspectives to broaden the discussion, or consider this all from your own head of big questions.
What a wonderful question. So I feel enormously grateful that my own family has not been touched by violence. We've not, experienced a shooting or any of that sort. But I did do a lot of research. So I read a lot of articles. I read books that have been written by survivors of gun violence and things of that nature. But it was also research of just talking with kids today. I think being in these schools and asking about what it feels like to do these lockdown drills and what do they think about the fact they have to do these lockdown drills. And then the last thing I do want to shout out is that my editor and my publishing team are always enormously awesome at this. They've been this way since my first book, when actually this wasn't like the industry standard, but they always get what's called expert readers to read the book. And we had a librarian educator who read it, who could read for like authenticity in the lockdown drill scenes that are in the book. And she had some really smart comments that, I thought I had done a lot of research and talked with a lot of kids, and there's nothing like someone who lives this and does these drills to look at it. And then also one of the expert readers who read for lots of things also was a survivor of gun violence and was able to provide insights. But I think, writing is an exercise in empathy, right? And empathetic imagination. And so even when I'm writing things that more closely align with my own life experience, I'm always having to exercise that muscle of empathetic imagination. And I think it's important to do the research. And I also think it's important to get the expert readers. But I also think I always like to say with my books that my stories are not supposed to be the universal experience of someone who has had this, it's one story that I made up to try to ask these really big questions about this really, really difficult and multi-pronged issue. And so what I always do that I think helps, and I did this with Other Words for Home, which I was obviously also writing outside of my own life experience for that book as well, is to narrow in scope the story that I'm telling and to have it be very specific. So I know exactly what these characters are going through, exactly what they are, and not try to write this like universal opinion piece about gun violence, or this universal opinion piece about refugee issues or immigration. And I think that when you narrow something in scope, it's much easier to tell a compelling story, and hopefully also to tell a responsible an authentic story. I think sometimes when you cast too wide of a net, that's where you run into a problem. I think that can be people's first impulse though, when they're writing outside of their lane, to try to make things as vague as possible so that they don't like get caught in not knowing things. But for me, it's the opposite. I try to get as weedy into the details as I can about these specific characters and their stories. And then when I can't find the answer I'm looking for, rely on those expert readers and research. But that's a great question. And it's definitely something I thought a lot about, and my editor, who I have to say is super responsible when it comes to those types of things, guided me through as well. And I feel so lucky, like I said, to have the type of publishing team who takes that really seriously too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fabulous answer. And I agree with you so much, because I mean, I think when you write a story, it is so much about specificity. And it is not an opinion piece. I mean, if you are, I don't think anybody could ever write a complete, I don't know, a complete piece reflecting every opinion or every nuance of something as complicated, as complex as this issue of gun violence. But, if you wanted to try to cast a wide net, then write an opinion piece, because I do think a nonfiction opinion piece that says so-and-so says this and so-and-so says something else is that. But this book is ultimately, it is about gun violence, but it is also about Cora and Quinn and their experience. And it's rooted, see the roots of that oak tree, it is rooted in their experience. And I think that's what makes it such a compelling story. I see Jennifer Carr, hey Jen, has a question. And she says, hi, Jasmine and Padma. And she says, you talked about writing multiple messy drafts. Could you talk about your revision process?
Hi, Jen. Jen is a fantastic bookseller at an amazing bookstore in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you're ever in Pittsburgh, you should visit Jen at City of Asylum Books. It's an amazing bookstore, and I'm so grateful to Jen, and she's an amazing advocate for books, particularly books by women of color, and we appreciate you, Jen, and love you. Thank you for being here. And for revision, yeah, I think of myself actually as a reviser. Like writing is revision. My books go through so many different drafts, and I actually think that one of the things that I'm doing as I revise is getting bolder and bolder. I tend to be very tentative in my first drafts. I'm sort of a tentative person too. I cage lots of things. I use lots of kind of hinged structures and things like that, or I don't know, or I don't necessarily go there with the plot point. And I think that every time I try to revise my way into that bolder story that I'm trying to tell, of trying to kind of free the story from, I sometimes will say on school visits that I kind of think of it as like when I learned way back in my old days of studying art history about, Renaissance sculptors that would say they had tried to find the life in this block of marble, and they would whittle it away. And I feel like that's how it is with me. My drafts are very clunky, and they're like these marble stones, and I'm slowly whittling away, trying to find that spirit, that heartbeat of what the story actually is. And so I've actually in the weeds at a process level to answer, I write a draft and then I go through it, and lots of times I delete up to 50 to 70% of it. I mean, I've talked at length a lot now about how Other Words for Home was totally rewritten. It wasn't even originally in verse. And Shape of Thunder in lots of ways had a similar process of lots of rewrite type drafts. But that's the only way I know how to do it. And I think every draft gets better, and I don't regret those other drafts because I learned something about the story that I was able to bring to the new draft. And then once I really get into it, obviously I have guidance from my editor who helps, and I view her as like the home inspector, right? Who's going and she's like, oh, this floor still isn't, gonna hold, or, the roof still has leaks. We need to fix that. That's kind of like the editor's job, right? To go through it until you have the house that will pass inspection. But it takes me a lot of Reno, I guess, to get there. Now I've thrown out lots of different metaphors, but
no, I love the metaphors. I absolutely love them. Did I cut you short? Did I?
No.
Oh, I was just going to say, I love the metaphors. I've used the idea of carving. We don't carve in marble, though. In India, we carve in granite, and I lived there. So I actually never went to school here, by the way. But I think of that, but I have never thought of my editor as a home inspector. And that just made me laugh so much. I'm going to tell Nancy Paulson tomorrow, hey, you're my home inspector. I love that. And I do want to say, I think here you're talking to two people who write messy drafts. There are other people who do it. So I also don't plot, but obviously every writer has their own way to reach the story. So if you are a person who plots, that's totally fine too. So just, find your process, whatever your process is, what works for you, try different things. And Jen is a fabulous writer too. And I cannot wait, Jen, to see your book sharing shelf space with all my other big collection one day. And I look forward to that. So I thought I saw one more question that was flashing by. If not, no, I have a question, because as you were speaking about other words for home, I wondered if there is a difference in your process of writing a book that is a novel in verse versus a book that is prose. And you spoke about how Other Words was for Home in the first draft was not a novel in verse. And I wondered if The Shape of Thunder ever was, or was it always in prose?
Yeah, so The Shape of Thunder was always in prose. Though I get asked a lot now, and I understand why, because I think at the time that I was working on The Shape of Thunder and drafted and conceived of it, I didn't have any idea about the reception that Other Words for Home would get, or that I would be mostly associated now with this book in verse, because I never thought of myself as a verse novelist at all until Other Words for Home. But I am always super interested in language. I think that my love of writing is sort of a marriage of a love of storytelling and also a love of language. I've just always been interested in the phonetic sounds of language, the way certain words paired together can make you feel. And so even in a prose book, I'm always looking at the sentence to be like, is that the best way I could say that? Or is that the exact way my character would say it? And so I think with a verse novel, though, that's just a little bit more heightened because you have less space, you have less words that you're afforded the chance to use. And I also think my books in prose are a tad bit more brainy and cerebral, whereas my verse books, I'm talking like I have multiple ones, Other Words for Home is much more of like a heart book. Not that The Shape of Thunder doesn't have a lot of heart. I hope that it does. And not that Other Words for Home doesn't have thoughts in it, but it's just like a question of, I think that kind of like more meatiness is possible in a prose novel in a way that isn't in a verse novel. And so you're trying to figure out in a verse novel kind of how to compensate for that. And you compensate by that by making sure every single word is doing a lot of work. But I don't actively think that I thought about it that differently. It's always just for me about telling the best possible story that I can. And so for Other Words for Home, I realized that was the best possible structure. Just like for The Shape of Thunder, exploring to figure out the best possible structure was this dual perspective structure. And then I'm always interested in the language. So it's not at all like with a prose book, I'm just like, let's just put the sentences and super like, focused on plot more so. No, like for me, the language is always at the forefront of like my interest in storytelling. So I think every writer you would talk to has like a thing that makes them the most excited about writing. And for me, for a long time, and sometimes I still do say it's character, and I do think I'm really interested in character, but I think at the end of the day, for me, it's really language is what I'm really, really like always return to, that I love and look for, and what delights me in other books and sticks with me. So.
And there is music. I mean, there's so much music in Other Words for Home, and there is so much music in Shape of Thunder as well. I have one other question for you, which is, and it came to me as you were talking, because we've spoken about the friendship that these two girls have. Was there any friendship that you brought with you from your childhood that is in some way reflected in the friendships that you see in, other words for home and The Shape of Thunder and just your books in general, all your books?
Yeah, so that's a beautiful question. So I had a really close best friend, who's my best friend throughout all of elementary school and middle school until we moved when I was in 8th grade, and her name is Chandra. And her and I had a friendship that was in a lot of ways like Quinn and Cora, and that we were outwardly very different. Like I was pretty like dreamy and could be kind of like shy and awkward, and was always like convincing her to play like a really elaborate game of Animorphs with me on the playground. And Chandra was more athletic and kind of even keeled and responsible. Like I just in all kinds of ways, like she was always, the one who would like clean up our snack. You know what I mean? She was just like much more thoughtful in that kind of a way. And like even silly things, like I couldn't tie my shoes until like way too long, which is embarrassing. And Chandra would tie my shoes for me when they came undone at school. We had that very like give and take, but some of the things in the book, like they play that game with the shapes, like drawing on their back. That's something Chandra and I definitely did. And just that thing of that is your person, and how much you sort of, I think when you're at that age, define yourself in the context of your friendship is something I think a lot about when I look back on my friendships at that age. But in just the security you feel, like I remember how much calmer, like I would get like anxious or feel like alone until like Chandra's class came to join for the field trip, and I was able to sit next to her on the bus. And then suddenly I'm a totally different kid because my friend is here. And so wanting to capture that, I think, love and security that friends bring, I really think that they're kind of that cornerstone, because right, the friends you make when you're in elementary school in lots of ways are the first relationships you have outside of your family unit. And that's you learning to be a person in the world in a separate way than you've defined yourself in your family. And I think that's really interesting, especially when we write for young people, to like showcase those relationships.
Absolutely. And it comes through in this one word that is in the book, which I absolutely it was both cute, but it was also so touching, was when Quinn puts Cora and me, and she does this as one word. It's Cora and me. And there is something there that you tapped into something very honest, and very not just honest, but very real and very, tangible. You really get where Quinn is coming from, and, the difficult time that she's having through no fault really of her own. So that there is that. And there are these letters as well that are woven into the book. So I love the way that you explore, even it's not just 2 points of view, it's also different structures that are woven into the book. Did you want to say something about the letters? I'm just looking at the time. We have about 5 minutes more. So if anyone has last questions, get them in.
I guess the only thing I'll say about the letters is the further I get into this, the more interested I get in alternative formats. I've learned young readers really love them. And you don't write a book to be like, please love this, young readers. But I do think you absorb things from school visits and understand that that's a dynamic that really seems to work for contemporary young readers. And like this idea of shifting perspectives too. And I think it's just our media is becoming more and more sophisticated, right? And I also, I'm sort of a dinosaur in this way of like, I really do think like novels are novels. And I really, at the foremost, like, don't ever view my novels as being like in competition with a video game or something like that. It's like, it's gonna be a book, and I want to honor all of the things that are beautiful about books. And I'm not trying to do that. But at the same point, I'm also interested in expanding the idea of what a novel can be and what its form can look like. And, I don't work with graphic novels right now. I haven't yet, but I love seeing the explosion of that and seeing this pairing of image and text. And I'm really buoyed by how many young readers seem to love verse novels and love poetry and respond to that form. And so I'm always just interested in finding the most inventive structure to tell the specific story I'm trying to tell. And I think that we have more and more like choices available to us. And I also just like so many of my favorite books use letters or use emails. And I delight in that as a reader. And so it's just fun to showcase your characters in those different ways. I mean, the letters actually kind of started as a character exercise for Quinn. I didn't think I would keep them in the book, and it was like a way for me to access how she felt about her brother so that I would know that better. And then I was like, wow, I really like this, and I really like the idea of starting her chapters with that. So yeah,
I
don't
do
know if that
too.
answers the question.
I do too. I mean, I'm so glad you kept that in, because I think that just, it adds, it really adds, it gives you an insight into the way that she thinks about her brother in a way that nothing else could have done. And so I'm just so glad you did that. I'm so glad it's in the book, not just in your notes. We are here at 8:56. So I don't know, Kathleen, if you have anything else to say to wrap up, but again, thank you to every one of you who've been here. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you, Anderson's Bookstore, for supporting both of us. Thank you, Jasmine, for making this something that I could do with you to celebrate this fabulous and important book.
Well, and thank you both. Oh my gosh, this was just an absolutely wonderful, wonderful evening. I could not have envisioned a better way to spend a Tuesday night at all. Jasmine, I am so proud of you and this book, The Shape of Thunder. And it is our pleasure, yes, exactly, to have this book on our shelves, to be able to put this in the hands of readers. And thank you for always being a friend to Anderson's, and Padma, you too. I mean, you ladies are really, two powerhouses that are writing for our kids today. And, I say that and I think about the times that I have encouraged my friends to read this book, read both of your books. And that's one of the things that I think you guys do so well, is you give us stories that we can share across generations. And that's what reading is all about, to connect us. And that's what you both do so well. And that's what Cora and Quinn's story is going to do. So, gosh, again, I could sit here and wax on all night, but y'all did not come to hear that. But thank you both, Padma, and thank you both, Jasmine. For those of you that asked to pick up your books at Anderson's, I think you'll get an email that says your book will be ready. If you wanted it shipped to you, we will get those out to you. If you have yet to pick up your book, run, don't walk to Anderson's or your closest indie bookstore or your public library to grab this book, because trust me, you need this book in your life. Absolutely, hands down. Carolyn, who is actually a coworker of mine, said earlier, and I'm trying to find the comment here, because she's tapped into my secret of book selling success, that I told her that she couldn't be my friend anymore until she read this book. And yes, y'all, I've started threatening people when I come across a book that I believe in so much that
That's why
they
we
have
love
to
you,
read
Kathleen.
it.
That's
No,
that passion.
I'm shameless. Yes, I am shameless. I will threaten people if I believe in a book enough. But again, ladies, both of you, thank you. And Jasmine, congratulations on this beautiful book that we just cannot wait to get into people's hands. So thank you both so much. Thank you all for those of you that came this evening, because without any of you, we wouldn't be here. Jasmine wouldn't be here. Padma wouldn't be here. So thank you all so much for your continued support of these beautiful stories, these beautiful authors, and of course for Anderson. So I guess that's it. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful
Thank you.
evening.
Bye. It was
Bye.
so fabulous. Thank you.